think what you're pointing to is one of the underlying themes that I get into around engagement, the subject or the domain of engagement with leaders and their teams, which is that the human element of creating an environment that leverages the capabilities, the talents, the insights, the wisdom from everyone is what we need to tackle these really complex problems.
Hi, Jeffrey. How are you?
I'm great. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's nice to have you here. I think you're my first American on the podcast. So
Wow.
I've done
I'm
quite
honored.
some interviews already, but you are my first American.
Well, and
Mostly I
I'm
have Dutch or Belgian people.
well, I'm honored, and I'm also an American in Netherlands. So
Yeah, just moved to Amsterdam. Great,
just
great
moved.
city. Lots of freedom there when it's not a lockdown period, of course.
That's true. Hopefully soon.
Yeah, and maybe you can tell a little bit more about yourself. Who are you?
I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I spend most of my time doing executive coaching, working with fast-growing companies, startups, C-suite leaders in major corporations in finance, pharmaceuticals, also in healthcare. I do a lot of work in hospitals, um, especially around the US, doing coaching and leadership training for physicians, surgeons, anesthesiologists, primary care. So it's a pretty wide range of clients that I work with in the executive coaching and leadership training space. And I also work part-time at Harvard Medical School as part of the faculty. And I was also at the Institute of Coaching at Harvard, which is a nonprofit research education institute dedicated to building, researching, and educating in the evidence base, the science behind coaching.
And when you say coaching, is it mostly one-on-one coaching or also team coaching?
Yes and yes. I would say primarily one-on-one coaching. But in the last few years, we have been doing a lot of research and education and work in internal coaching, external coaching, life coaching, health and wellness coaching, team coaching, as you mentioned. So coaching itself has expanded to cover quite a few different categories.
Yeah, nice. And you wrote a book called Flex. So why did you decide to write a book?
Well, the impetus for writing the book came a few years ago when I started to see that the kinds of people that I was coaching were changing dramatically. There were very big demographic and cultural shifts going on. My practice was becoming more global, and there was a much greater variety in the type of people that I was coaching. And I realized that two things were happening at the same time. Number one, the science behind executive coaching and executive development or leadership development was becoming much more refined, which is from the work that I was doing at the Institute of Coaching. And yet it was not as well known in the public sphere because it tends to be in academia, it tends to be research, academic. And I wanted it to become more known that there's a lot of good science behind good coaching these days. So that was one of my motivations. And then secondly, as I said, I was starting to see the practice of my clients changing dramatically. There was a time when I first started coaching when most of my clients were senior executives that were white men that were particularly authoritative or charismatic or more what we traditionally think of as an alpha style leadership behavior and approach. And I was starting to see a lot more variety. And I wanted to honor that. I wanted to write a book that would describe more case studies of a wide range of leadership behaviors that I was seeing becoming more and more effective in companies that are becoming flatter, more networked, the rise of the millennial generation, which is a more tech savvy, more interconnected, more networked organizational approach. And some of those folks that I was coaching were really starting to work in different ways. And I wanted to honor that. I really wanted to elevate what I considered to be the next great wave of leadership, which I
Yeah.
call the beta revolution.
And do you believe it's more like the fact that leadership became more diverse that started changing the trend and the market and the way to go? Or do you think it's because the alpha way of leading was not working anymore that people started to change? What is it, do you think?
That's a great question. Maybe a little bit of both, because I would say that the authoritative alpha style leader is still valid under certain circumstances. But if you're really trying to become creative and innovative and fast, leading edge companies these days really need to have new ideas. The environment is becoming more and more competitive, more global, more interconnected. That having all the power and all the decision making and all the leverage at the very top with just a few people that are called the C-suite or the CEO or whatever, that's actually limiting the amount of innovation, limiting the creativity of the organization. So to your question, I think there is a certain argument that can be made that the alpha style leader is useful in certain circumstances like emergencies, or the pilot of a plane, I hope, would be an alpha. I mean, I really want to get the plane safely from one place to another, and they need to be very directive. But if you're really trying to be innovative, which I think is key for companies today, and today where the world is more complex and the problems that we face with the environment, with the ecology, are just so much more difficult, then we need to have the creativity from everyone.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's important to have more variety in the leaders.
It's nice that you say that, because when you were telling that in certain circumstances we still need the alpha leader, I was really wondering in which ones, except like you say, emergencies or a plane, but in most large organizations operating in a fast changing market, what I see is that the alpha leader isn't working anymore. It has become too slow.
Exactly.
And not inspiring anymore for the people working on the floor.
I totally agree, which is why the first case study in my book, to me, is really the archetype of success, which is I coached a surgeon. Now, when you think about an orthopedic surgeon, this is someone that you need to have as an alpha, right? Mm-hmm. They need to be able to direct your surgery so that you survive, that you live, that you're healed. But that very same surgeon became a beta style leader 2 or 3 hours after surgery. They were very empathic. They were very consensus oriented. He was a great listener. And so he had the ability to flex his style from being in the operating room, which is a very directive kind of environment, being with his colleagues or with the younger staff, where he needed to be a different, more listening, empathic kind of leader. And that's actually became my role model. So for me, it wasn't about getting rid of all the alpha leaders, but it was really about training and developing a more flexible style to get the best out of everyone.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I don't know if you're aware of the 7 levels of consciousness from Barrett.
I am. Yes.
Yeah.
I have heard of that. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's also what he's telling. Like in the 7 levels of consciousness, you also have 7 levels of leadership styles. And it's not that one is better than the other. It's ideally you should master all the levels and apply each level for each situation.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the situation where you want to get the greatest number of ideas, to be innovative and to move quickly, is an environment where you want to have the higher level, more consciously awake leader who's really empathic and intuitive and listening and creating an environment of psychological safety where the talents of everyone are considered really crucial and important.
Yeah, exactly. Completely agree. And I'm also curious, you say that you did some science and some research behind leadership coaching. And what is the science then behind it? What is science telling us about good leadership today?
Well, I think there's two components to that. Research around what are the domains that are primarily focused on the development areas for leaders, which is one of the key elements of my book, the different dimensions of leadership. The research that I did was with focus groups with hundreds of coaches to determine what are the areas that leaders need to most develop. So that's one component of research. I think what you're pointing to, though, is sort of more the science that's underpinning good leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the science is really coming out of other fields. For example, the research on mindfulness that's demonstrating that leaders that are more present, that develop mindfulness practices so that they can be focused, they can be flexible, they can be present with their staff or with their team, are much more effective in making decisions that are likely to lead to positive outcomes. And also some of the neuroscience that's being done around research around positive psychology. Richard Boyatzis is a very well-known researcher who studied with using fMRI studies of the brain to determine what really motivates people and to change or to become more effective in their work, right? And a lot of that is based on positive, compassionate, motivating, not negative input. So the work that that's being done in the science underpinning feedback is really crucial. And of course, coaching is a lot about feedback.
Yeah.
So there's been a lot of really good research that demonstrates that when you give positive feedback, feedback that expands what someone does and takes it to another level of effectiveness, is much more likely to work and be motivating than if you're telling people what they're doing wrong or you're telling people what their weaknesses are, that kind of thing. So those are just a couple of examples. There's quite a few. I could keep going.
No, what I like to see is that in a world that is more and more digital, as leaders, we have to become more and more human again and closer to our human nature.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is that there's been some good research done recently on the integration of technology and coaching and technology and mentoring. Because there's fear, I think, that some folks have that technology will replace leadership activity or coaching activity. That you will have an app on your phone that will be a therapist or a coach or something like that. And the studies that have been done have shown that it's when you integrate the technology effectively with one-on-one or group work with real people, that's when you get the best value. That's when you get the best outcomes. Because some of these technologies are useful. Mindfulness reminders, habit forming. So you develop positive habits. You have something on your iPhone that reminds you to do something on a regular schedule, like exercise, or checks to make sure that you're getting enough sleep or nutrition. I mean, some of these things that are technologically driven are actually very beneficial, but they will not replace the real, true empathic connection of a relationship with another human being. So it's the integration of them that's being shown to be really powerful.
But it's the same for the business models of organization. It's the integration of both. Just, I always say, automate what you can automate and things that are where people don't need human contact, but then invest in real emotional experiences for your customers on the other side. So you don't need a real human being if you want to do a bank transfer, but if you want to buy a house and to make a loan or a big investment, there you want to talk to a real person. Don't automate that process. So that's
Yeah,
exactly.
and I think what you're pointing to is one of the underlying themes that I get into around engagement, the subject or the domain of engagement with leaders and their teams, which is that the human element of creating an environment that leverages the capabilities, the talents, the insights, the wisdom from everyone is what we need to tackle these really complex problems like the environment. that cannot be replaced by machine. So if we can automate some of the more simplistic things that are being done by the people that are not particularly emotionally satisfying, and then we can leverage human talents to focus on some of the more difficult and challenging and complex problems, like energy, for example, or restoring the balance of nature, and or really the next level of recycling, really moving toward a restorative economy. Those are really complex challenges, but we can tackle them if we have leaders that are committed to getting the best out of their people, the real creative spark out of their team.
And now I'm really curious, is how do you help those alpha leaders become, you call them beta leaders? Beta leaders. How do you help them do that transition? Because it's very uncomfortable to do that switch when you are an alpha leader.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the way that I find is most successful is by helping the alpha leader to recognize it all comes down to self-awareness at the very beginning, which is becoming aware of their strengths. That being an alpha leader, being visionary, being directive, being authoritative, being decisive, having a strong, confident sense of communication is very positive. Those are all good traits. So recognizing them as strengths, but then recognizing that that's a limitation if that's all you do, if you don't continue to expand the repertoire. I often will use the analogy with an alpha leader of banging on you're trying to be a pianist and you're world-class at banging on the piano. But what happens if someone gives you a piece by a composer that requires a really beautiful, soft, slow, present, almost a dreamlike stance in music, and all you know how to do is pound on the keys? So you have to learn to step back and take a breath and soften your approach. And the metaphor holds that you can be alpha, and that's a great strength, but if you want to have a wide range, you want to have a full repertoire, then you also need to know how to be quiet. You also need to know how to ask questions and listen. You also need to know how to be the orchestra leader and getting the other people in the room to feel empowered, to step up and to offer their ideas, which is sort of, as you said, not always easy for the alpha. But what I basically look to do is to challenge an alpha leader to recognize the limitations of what they do as being kind of a one-trick pony or a one-stop shop, that they can expand their repertoire, just like you would with a musical instrument.
Yeah. And what I notice also with the leaders in my program is that often they know they have to become another leader. They know they have to become empathic, that they have to listen and co-create and all these things. But as soon as they are under pressure or that something goes wrong, not as planned, they become dominant again without being aware of it. And that they don't always see.
Yep, I totally agree. And that's when they need the coach on their shoulder.
Yeah, the coach on their shoulder and the true feedback, that they need to be open to this true feedback from the people around them that could tell them, this is not okay. You want more empowerment, but now you become directive again. Which one do you want?
Yeah. And so what I will often do in situations like that is I will ask my client, my alpha leader, who on their team is a really successful beta leader, who is quieter and yet still very effective, who is curious and collaborative and consensus oriented, but also very effective. And I will ask them to partner with that person, to give them permission, to give them feedback.
That's a great idea. Yeah, that's a great idea.
It's a buddy system, right?
Yeah.
And they can learn from each other because, I have case studies in my book of beta style leaders who are what I call the reluctant leader. They tend to be a little more introverted. They tend to rather stay in the back, and they're very empowering to let other people lead. But there are times when they need to be at the front of the room and they need to say, okay, guys, we're going forward. So they also can have a buddy or a model of someone that they look to and emulate.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I like today is that people always like simple things, but also the leadership has become more complex. It's not that you have to be a coaching, mentoring leader all the time. Sometimes people need direction.
Yep.
Or it's not like you need structure all the time. You need the balance between chaos and structure. It's not that you need speed all the time. You have to know when you need to slow down and pause and when you need to accelerate.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. The pace is complex because the paradox is that you want innovation and you want speed and you want to beat the competition and you want to be out ahead of everyone else. And yet creativity cannot be forced.
Mm-hmm.
You have to take time. You have to breathe. You have to take a walk in nature. The science, getting back to your question about the science, there's good science now, real research that have studied people that take the time to get in touch with nature, to go out hiking, their likelihood of being better problem solvers is much higher than those that don't do that. So yeah, it's a paradox. You have to be able to live in those places where you move back and forth.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's really and that's the difficulty. And what I see today, I see a lot of leaders that have calendars fully booked and they have no time to answer their emails or to do the work, and then not even time to stop and think and see what emerges, because like you say, it's that creativity that will make all the difference.
Right. Yeah, it is an interesting contradiction because their calendar is back to back to back to back with task-oriented conversations and meetings.
Yeah.
And yet then in the middle of a meeting, they will turn to their team and say, I want everyone to be really creative today. Like, excuse me? There's no time for us to be creative. So the most advanced leaders are beginning to realize that they need to actually put creative, mindful, quiet, non-directed time into their calendar. You know, some of my most effective leaders will actually have big chunks of their calendar that they will not schedule. They call it me time, my time.
Exactly.
And you find out what your rhythm is. You know, I know when I was writing my book, I continued to coach people, I continued to teach, I continued to work, but I always carved out very early morning time because I was most creative for a couple of hours in the morning, and I would make sure that that was sacred. So I always ask my clients, when are you most creative? And some people it's early in the morning, some people it's in the middle of the afternoon, they take a little nap and they're creative, some people they're nighttime, but make that creative time sacred. And also give your people, if you're a leader, give your people permission to have that time.
Yeah.
I have a client who's working with someone who loves to work at night, and they're a statistician, they're a brilliant mathematician, they're super smart. But my client was mad because his staff person was coming in late in the morning and not doing the routine 9 to 5. And I said, what is the problem? Why don't you go to work at 9? He said, because I'm up at 2 o'clock in the morning and I'm solving these incredible problems with the folks in Europe because they just got up, you know, it's a time zones.
Yeah.
And I said, well, you need to tell the boss that that's your creative time. And he said, yeah, but then he's very attached to the time zone, you know, 9 to 5, blah, blah, blah. So we had to have a conversation, obviously. And the good news is the boss was like, oh, you're right, that some people are creative at different times. I need to be more flexible. So.
Yeah, and then you have the people like me. I'm my rhythm, because I paid a lot of attention to my rhythm, but I noticed that I have a rhythm like sometimes I work very efficiently and very quickly, and then I do nothing for quite a while, and then very efficient and quick. But it's not like it's in the morning or in the afternoon. It's really, days where I'm very efficient. And I know that if you try to put me in a box, like you have to work from 9 to 5, I'm not efficient and not productive at all. Right. And I see a lot of people like that. They're at work, but at times, like sometimes you just feel that you're not there anymore. So it's better to stop, go for a walk, and then come back instead of forcing yourself to continue.
I agree. Yeah. I do think that if there's one silver lining to this disruption that we've all experienced in the past year, is there is now a recognition that productivity is not directly connected to the number of hours you spend in an office. I think it's always been true, but we are finally going to move beyond this kind of machine-like mindset that says that human beings are like robots and they need to clock in at 9 a.m. and clock out at 4 p.m. That's not going to be creative. If you're doing a routine job, which could probably be automated, that may be true. But if you want creativity, then yeah, you have to start to get into the circadian rhythms of the human
Exactly.
being, right? Seasons and times and sleep and nature. And yeah, and I'm really hoping that a lot of my clients have begun to realize that their people can be incredibly productive and they don't need to be monitored 24 hours a day. They don't need to work just 8 hours. They can really get a lot of creativity and a lot of work done on their own time, on their
Yeah.
own volition.
Yeah. But the sad thing is that I think a lot of people realize this, a lot of leaders realize this, but not many of them manage to actually implement it, because for me there is also a systemic approach
Oh,
to
yeah.
this. And if your organization is structured in a way that your team is very dependent on other teams, you can try and change the habits of people, and the leader might say, just work whenever you want. If you spend your whole day in meetings because you constantly need information or feedback or approvals from other teams, then it's not possible. So sometimes you also have to change the whole organizational structure to get there.
Yeah. No, I think you're talking about something that's very true and challenging, which is the systemic and historical cultural infrastructure and architecture that we have set up as a Western society in particular, but I think it's also true in other Eastern societies, is not going to be easy to change.
No.
Um, but I'm cautiously optimistic that people are beginning to realize that if we are going to save the planet, if we are going to become more ecologically sustainable and regenerative, that we have to change some of these things. The systems that we have are ultimately destructive of not only the human um, capability, but they're also destructive of the planet. So,
But
it's
also of the results of the organization, because if your
right,
people spend, and especially now in COVID times where a lot of people are working from home, it's really, statistics show that people work on average 1 hour more every day.
right. They work more. That's true.
Yeah, well, they don't commute anymore. They just go from one Zoom meeting to the next without leaving their office. It's horrible for a lot of them.
Yeah, I'm hoping that that's a transitional state because this has been so disruptive. Um, and I try to retain a certain amount of cautious optimism that a lot of the leaders that I work with will start to realize that they need to have they need to have more balance in their lives, and that balance involves sleep, it involves exercise, it involves time in nature, and that the more they take care of themselves, the more productive they will be on shorter amounts of time, and that's also true for their people. So, I think that the smaller companies, the entrepreneurial companies, they can already start to do
Yeah.
some of these things. The big ones, it's tough.
The big ones need to really change their organizational structure if they want that. And
I agree.
that takes a lot of courage, because often the decision is being made by the directors, and the directors will be the first one to lose their job when you change the structure from a functional structure to a cross-functional structure. Then you don't need a marketing director and a sales director and a finance director anymore.
Exactly.
You need all these mini business units. So it's really then it's a question of courage.
You're absolutely right. But I do see some companies that are beginning to break down these silos. It's happening. It's probably,
more and more.
It needs to be happening faster, but it is happening.
Yeah. And then you talked already a little bit about meditation or mindfulness, but you also talk about emotional agility, because I believe that this switch is also a switch happening inside of us. In the past, you could go for being just rational.
Right.
You had to be rational, and emotions stood in the way, and your body was only there to support your head and to be beautiful, of course.
Right.
But now more and more leaders realize they have to work with emotions and their body if they want to become a great leader. And you have developed a model that you call the 4 F's of emotional agility. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, I actually divided my book up into 3 domains: the cerebral, the emotional, and the somatic. And I think, and these 4 areas of emotional agility fit into that. But yeah, I totally agree with you that the days of the things that we used to call soft skills, which were the emotional or emotive side of leadership, are actually the hardest things of all, and they're the key to success. And to my mind, they can be summarized by these four F's: focus, feelings, I'm going to forget my own 4 F's now: flexibility and
feedback.
Feedback, exactly. But they're all components of basically regulating one's emotional state. If you think about focus, it is about getting grounded and being present, and that involves paying attention to the body and to the emotions. And it is rational to a certain extent because there's a thinking component to it, but it incorporates all 3: emotional, physical, and somatic. That it requires being grounded, being centered, and being intentional. So that's really what it means, what I mean by being focused. And feelings, obviously, are key to recognizing your own emotions, to honoring that there's almost always an emotional component to every decision we make. That when we have a reaction to the world, we typically have an emotional reaction first. Mm-hmm. The amygdala is the part of our brain that reacts instantaneously, long before it gets to upfront to the cognitive part of our brain.
And sometimes with your body as well. Huh? Your body and emotions are there before your rational mind.
Totally. I think that your body reacts instantaneously. Studies have been done around what is trust and how do people create trust. And all of the research points that trust is something that is completely nonverbal and non-rational. Trust is something that happens in your physical connection, through your eye contact, through your smile, through your facial muscles, through your hand gestures. I always tell people, if they're on Zoom, try to make sure you allow people to see your hands occasionally. Because otherwise they wonder, what are you doing? Do you even have hands? Do I trust you? And so it's good to do occasional gesture to remind people, hey, I'm not just a brain on a stick. I'm an entire body.
Yeah. So I'll show you mine there.
Yeah, exactly. It's great. I mean, it's something we all forget.
Yeah.
And then the last one is very straightforward, which is feedback. And it's ironic that feedback is such a complex subject for us, because feedback is actually very simple. If you think of the human body, it is a feedback machine. We're getting feedback all the time. Maintaining your metabolism is done through physical feedback. Your system is giving itself feedback. Your stomach, your organs, everything is constantly in a feedback loop. So where we are in the world is also a feedback loop. how we respond to the weather, how we respond to other people, how we respond to changes in the situation that we're in. It's constantly giving us feedback. It's a question of whether we're paying attention. So my intention around writing about that and raising our awareness about it is for people to not be so afraid of feedback and to look at it as an opportunity to learn, be on a learning journey about what works. And that's what the research shows, is that if we can think of feedback as an opportunity to grow and expand, not as a way to punish or criticize, then feedback is less scary.
Mm-hmm.
And so many of the more advanced organizations that I work with are starting to do feedback regularly instead of once a year. And that can be very scary if you don't do it well. But doing it well means to do it in such a way that supports the growth of people, so that they learn, so that they're motivated, so they feel good about themselves and their strengths, and they're looking constantly to expand.
Yeah, but feedback, what I notice is that, okay, receiving feedback is already not easy, but we know we need to receive it, and so it becomes more normal. But it's the giving feedback that is difficult, because people don't want to hurt someone's feeling, and so you really have sometimes to go back again inside to your emotions, to what is happening inside your body, and to free yourself from that so that you can give that feedback. Because
Yeah, and
often, yeah.
Right, I agree. It can be challenging, but there's a very easy technique that I would suggest to people that are struggling with giving feedback, which is to always start with what works. Because if you think of that person sitting across from you or on the Zoom from you, and you want to give them feedback about a change that you would like to encourage, if you're thinking that you don't want to hurt that person, then don't hurt that person. Start from what you know they do well, and then look to incorporate the feedback in a way that's an expansion. And if you think about it that way, you can probably give the feedback, pretty much really negative feedback, in a way that's framed as a positive expansion.
Yeah. Yeah, but in my experience, every time I've given feedback, it happened really well. It was a great conversation, and often it strengthens the relationship, even if it's negative feedback. But it's the idea that I should give feedback that was blocking me more than the doing. And that's often what is happening. And so you find unconscious excuses for yourself to not give that feedback, because still, you want to be liked often.
Yeah, but I agree, and I think it can be challenging. But I guess what I would always come back to is, what is your intention?
Mm-hmm.
If your intention at the end of the day is to help someone grow, to help someone become more of manifest their full potential, then it's a gift to give them feedback in a way that expands their possibilities. And if you think about it that way, then that may help you develop the inner courage and be inspired to give people feedback.
Yeah, and that's not only for feedback, that's for everything. When you
Totally.
constantly reconnect to, why do I do this? Why is it important to me? And what is my intention? That's when you reach great results. But you have to know what you want first. And there again, there are not many people who really know what they want.
Yeah, well, that takes some self-reflection.
Yeah.
Which is why coaching is such a core skill and a core experience to have in your life, to have a coach and to be a coach. Because the grounding of effective coaching, which is at the heart of what I wanted to write about in this book, is that it's about becoming more aware of your gifts. Mm-hmm. And the more you then become aware of your gifts and of your strengths, the more you ultimately, hopefully, you're motivated to give that away to other people. And that's how we hopefully make the world a better place.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said the 4 Fs, you still had flexibility.
Well,
So,
flexibility we've talked about all during this call, really, which has been about that idea that you're not just one kind of leader,
mhm.
that you are an emotional leader, you're a rational leader, you're a physical presence, you can be very directive, but you can also be very curious and very inquisitive. And maybe my best examples of leaders are also great followers, not just leaders. Sometimes people say to me, how can you do that? How can you be both a leader and a follower? Well, being a good follower is a skill because it means identifying who else can take charge, who can step up, and supporting them to take the lead. That's actually a leadership attribute. And it requires a great deal of flexibility to step forward and then step back, to step forward and then step back. Or
Yeah,
as they say, to lead from the back. So that's what I mean by flexibility.
yeah, yeah. And I agree because there again, I often say I believe that people should lead from their strength. But then for your weaknesses, there you collaborate, or like you say, you follow someone else. If you know that you're not so good in this, you could develop it, but then it's often at the cost of your strength. Like
Right.
I'm very good in thinking out of the box. I'm not very good in following detailed processes, but then I can work with someone who's very good at that, and I will follow that person, like you say.
Absolutely. Yeah, when I first started my coaching business quite a few years ago, one of my dear friends was a business partner. And I look back now on we're still friends many years later, and we were very successful. And part of the reason we were successful is because he had traits that I was just not good at. He was trained as an engineer, he's very quantitative, and he also had emotionally the ability to know the necessary things to protect us. Whereas I tended to be a little bit more entrepreneurial, willing to take risks. I tend to be kind of more, I wouldn't say creative. He's actually quite creative, but I was kind of more out there. But I remember times when he would say, Jeff, we need to have insurance. Like we need to have this done and before we do that. And we need to fill in this spreadsheet before we can do that. And I would say, oh gosh, I can't do any of that stuff. I can't even learn that. And I was so grateful because those were his talents, those were his skills, and we made a great team. So yeah, recognizing when you want to team up with complementary skills. And I also learned from him. I learned how to buy insurance and recognizing the value. So it's not like he couldn't develop it, but I needed to respect and honor his skills in order to be able to develop mine.
Yeah. Nice. Well, it was a nice conversation, and I'm really glad we've met. We seem to be
Yeah.
on a very same vision of leadership. And where can people find you, and or if people want to be coached by you, or what are the things that you offer? Coaching, but you also offer other things, maybe?
Well, yeah. I mean, the primary focus of my services is leadership coaching. I would say that is probably the bulk of my work. But I also do team coaching, and I also do a number of webinars, educational programs, keynote speeches around productivity, well-being, coaching culture, that kind of thing for a lot of organizations. The best place to find me is on my website, which is jeffreyhull.com.
Yeah, and we will put that in the show notes of the episode.
Great.
Well,
Well,
it
it's been a
was really
pleasure.
nice meeting you.
You too. Thank you so much for having me. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Take care. Great
Take
meeting you.
care. You too. Bye,
Bye.
Jeffrey. This was a nice conversation, and we were pretty much aligned. So, you need to flex your leadership style to get the best out of everyone. The alpha style leader can still be useful in emergency situations or for flying a plane, but otherwise become a beta style leader and listen to people and really try to get the best out of them. So I'll see you in our next episode where I'll talk about micromanagers. Be sure to subscribe or to leave me a review if you haven't done so far. Thank you. Bye.